So as we start, I think it would be good to focus on the two assignments that you'll be required to do. The first assignment is going to be the assignment that you'll be required to do in the next 4 weeks, or 2 weeks actually, so week 4. And because that's going to be coming up very quickly, then that's going to be quite urgent. So let's have a look then at this first assignment. So you're asked to choose one of the theories or theorists, and you're asked to then think how this relates to your own education experiences and to teaching and schooling in the classroom. And last week we introduced you to 3 theories. The first theory is functionalism or fixed structure. And this says that not only your classroom and what you do, but the school and what happens in society is built around fixed structures that have a function. And one of the major functions is to get people ready for work. So we teach maths and science so people will be ready for work because there's great benefits. You'll get a good job, you'll get well paid. So we educate for future jobs and other roles in society, which can be so the government will flourish, so that all the social institutions will flourish, finance will flourish, we'll care for one another, we'll exercise and eat well. The second one is that despite Parsons saying this is one of the main ways that schools and society work, so that everything functions well, and we could then study those functions, conflict theory says that there's a lot going on under the surface in which conflicts take place. Different people from different classes have more opportunity or miss out. Men have more opportunity, women miss out. Some from a white middle-class culture have more opportunity. From another culture, you miss out. And so conflict theory is the second theory that you could write about: social disadvantage, inequality. And then the third theory is that another level of complexity is that the very language we use, the symbols that we use, and also the relationships that we have either empower or disempower students. So when it comes to gender, we either use male language or female language, or when it comes to class, we use white dominant language or not. So there's a lot happening in language and in the social interactions in which look friendly enough, but some people may be missing out. And then fourthly, I want to speak about Christian perspectives. And so today I'm going to come back to these 3 theories, and I'm going to suggest you could do an assignment in 2 weeks' time on one of them as it applies in your own experience and in the classroom teaching today. And you could look at scholars and theorists like George Herbert Mead, who talks about self-identity coming from social interactions, play, games, family, school and workplace, active learning, etc. And we'll look more at that next week. You could look at emotions, and Hochschild looks at the role of emotions. We didn't look at that so much last week, but you could explore that. And you could explore Christian aspects as well. The second half of this assignment asks you to do at least a paragraph or more reflecting on your own experience growing up and at school, and it would be good to write some positive experiences and some negative experiences and to communicate something about those. And the guidelines encourage you there. In the second research paper in week 8 and 9, you'll be looking at one of the groups, either race, Indigenous, other cultures, how they have opportunities or miss out because they come from a different culture, class, inequality and social justice, how they have opportunity or miss out, and gender, opportunity or miss out. We ask you to choose one of those. So that's the assignment. And then in today's topic, I want to go on and look at some of these in more detail. So,
excuse me, sorry, Sam.
Yeah, sure.
If we were to, for the second assignment,
Yes.
or anything like that. Do you want us to do like write about race in total, like thinking about people from African descent, Asian descent, Indigenous people, or do we pick like specific issues that might apply to specific groups, like say Indigenous people? Could we do an assignment just on Indigenous difficulties in education?
The more specific, the better.
Okay,
And if you
cool, sweet.
chose one particular Australian Indigenous group, and so it could be one particular Indigenous First Nation group in Queensland,
Yeah,
and the more specific you could be, the better. And then I would focus on 3 or so specific aspects. So their worldview, perhaps, language, self-identity. I would certainly include some theorists. And to do that, I would go to Google Scholar. And in Google Scholar, I'd do a search, and it could be sociology of First Nation Indigenous education in Australia. And but again, I'd try and even get some information on the group, and then I'd do some practical application. And So you'd want to focus on education, teaching, those sorts of things, and then you'd want to include something there on specific application. And you'd want 8 to 12 or so scholarly resources. You want a bit of a general introduction in the first paragraph or two, and then you could say, this assignment will focus on, and then you would choose that group that you would focus on. You always have a choice as to, do you focus on just one group, or do you choose 2 or 3? Sometimes you get profitability in choosing 2 or 3, but the more groups you choose, the thinner is your study. So I think focusing is always better. Any other questions about those 2 assignments? And if you do one topic in one assignment, you wouldn't choose an identical topic in the other assignment. 5 or 10% you could carry over from one to the other, but you would want to have different topics in the 2 assignments. Any other questions there on the 2 assignments? So today I want to look a bit more at sociology for education by saying, firstly, schooling has grown tremendously over time. If we were to use history to study this change, it would really tell us a lot. We could look at the ancient world 2,000 years ago, the medieval world, wonderful as it was, and then the with knights and all those wonderful things happening. And then we could look at the Protestant Reformation, the early modern period. And in the modern industrial world, things have changed, and schooling now is so important. And history tells us, when they developed the steam engine and the spinning machine and all of the modern industrial processes, it meant that everyone could be more wealthy in some ways, but we needed more schooling to contribute to that wealth. And so in the 1800s, you had factories and people worked there, and now maybe the factory fodder is replacing. So there's been social change, and as a result, governments make decisions as to where they put the money. One of the interesting decisions made in the last 5 years was that we were spending money on the humanities and the arts, where that money at university and training and education could go to science and maths, and they decided to reduce spending on the arts and humanities and history and increase spending on science and maths. So that shows how governments can make decisions about where society is going. And whether you agree with it or not, I think many people would say we need a more holistic education that includes everything, not just science and maths. But you can see where things could go, can't you? Maybe your class will be 90% science and maths, and just, half an hour a day for everything else. Who knows? So science has grown, schooling has grown all around the globe because there are benefits. If we all come into cities, urbanized, and is anything lost in this, is the question that could be asked. So the rise of the schooled society is one of the big historical changes, and we could use sociology and psychology to study this and the impact it has on education and schooling. Certainly as a teacher, you wonder about these sort of studies because really you want to just study your topic, primary school education, history or whatever you're teaching, 2 or 3 subjects. But part of the education teaching program is that it's so important to know some educational psychology and something about society, something about government and economics and these big questions. And so it's said by all the experts, it's important to do a little bit of study of society, and that's called sociology. And you could go further in this. You could get a master's and you could look at these areas and look at how schools emerge and how the needs have really changed and developed. So even 50 years ago, many children didn't go on to upper secondary matriculation. University, it was quite uncommon. Women often wouldn't go on. Women wouldn't work so long back in the 1950s and 60s. If your husband got a job, the woman was expected to stop working, look after the family at home, welcome the husband when he comes home at 5:30 or so with open arms and a freshly cooked meal. So things have changed in 50 years. And the government realises now if we could get every woman in Australia working, then we could double the workforce and everyone would be double the riches. And you could buy more electronic gadgets and have a second refrigerator and everyone would be happier for that. So sociology looks at all of these questions. So the roles that schools play have evolved, but even 2,000 years ago in Greek society, Christian society, Hebrew society, there was still a role, but it often ended at the end of grade 6 primary. And if you go to the USA and visit an Amish community in the USA, then you would find there in the Amish community, they still only go to grade 6. And so Amish community, if you look at that, and you can visit the Amish community where they ride around on horse and buggy in Philadelphia. So Amish community. And I got to visit there a couple of years back and it was a really nice experience. But it's interesting there, push bikes don't have any pedals on the push bikes because that could destroy society. People would be able to ride their bikes further than the shop and everything would fall apart. And so even today, people are offering an alternative society, which is the Amish community. And then at age 17 or so, you get to go out for a year or so into the wider world. And then you have to decide, do you come back into the Amish community where education stops at the end of year 6? And that's all you need. And then if you graduate with a good year 6, you can become a teacher and teach the next generation coming through. So our Western society is not the only way that we need to live society. And all through history, there have been ways of looking at a bit. You'll see in a Western school, there's a huge emphasis on maths. I mean, I taught maths for 10 or 20 years and I still puzzle. And my wife tells me, do you need to learn geometry? And do you need to learn the angles of a triangle, all that up to 180 degrees and all of that? And some of you may puzzle over why we teach so many hours maths every year in school, primary to secondary. And geometry and those areas. And then English is another one of the big ones. Everyone needs to learn full stops and commas, if I can say that, and the other English requirements. And then artificial intelligence is really going to challenge us on all of this. And then a third one is science. And then it would be good if everyone learned a second language. And then possibly history and geography are important. I could make humorous jokes there, couldn't I, about whether USA thinks you need any more geography than the states of the USA. And then you've got literature, art, drama, music. Physical exercise and sport seem to be high importance. and diet. So every cultural group is going to have these important themes, but a well-rounded holistic development sees that more than just these subjects is going to be important. Interestingly, it can be argued that Christianity and Protestant influences over the last 2,000 years have played a huge role in the development of schooling. And also universities. That is, the first universities at Oxford, Cambridge, Padua, Paris were church universities, initiated to train priests and accountants and bishops and everything else that was essential to society. But there was an increased focus on religion up until 1800, when with the rise of modern liberalism, that is the freedom for everyone to be part of a capitalist consumerist society, religion has fallen to one side. Perhaps others say it hasn't. People still believe without belonging, say some sociologists such as Grace Davey. So again, we come to three ways of describing what's happened. The first way is that schools provide important functions, training students for society. Governments put money into that. Interestingly, up until 1870 in Australia, the churches provided the schools, and then in 1870, with the rise of bigger cities and more industry, they realized we needed more people to go to school. Churches couldn't meet that need, and we had secular schools begin in 1870 through to 1960. And then in 1960, the Menzies government realizes that the secular can't meet all needs, so they start putting money back into Christian schools. And since that time, Christian schools have grown from 20% of schooling to about 40% of schooling. So for those who feel the society is in decline, we have a decline from 20% to 40%, which is a puzzle. And I think societies, I've always concluded, go up and down rather than decline. And you look at the Old Testament, Book of Judges, society goes up and down. You look at the New Testament, crucifixion of Jesus, growth of the early church, persecutions, growth again. It's a cycle of up and down. Waves come through society. History and sociology could tell us. In the 1870s through to the modern time, science has grown, and in the early 1900s, B.F. Skinner, who started out doing an arts degree but changed to a more scientific approach, behaviouralist approach, says that people's behaviours are conditioned. And if you apply that in the classroom, you need to have strict punishments and strict rewards, would say B.F. Skinner. Cantor also says that you need strict rules in the classroom. You need positive reinforcement, corrective actions, and you need very swift correction of misbehavior, says Cantor. So this is a scientific approach, a behavioralist approach. However, if we take a more conflict-oriented approach, we realise that this could be imposing views by the white middle class. Everyone needs to learn, commas and full stops, but really there's other things going on in the working class and different cultures and the First Nation people. So conflict theories recognise that there's other things going on under the surface. And then the third theory, the symbolist interactionists, say the very language we use. So if you're from a First Nations people and they allow you to speak your language, that could help. The English were very wise. In back around 1900 or so, they banned the Welsh language because you wouldn't want the Welsh people rising up. In recent times, if you try and drive through Wales, all the signs have gone back to Welsh on the roads and things. So if you can't speak Welsh, you're in trouble in part of Great Britain. And Scotland's trying to do the same. So the language you speak affects identity, affects what you think schooling's about, affects what everything's going on about. So symbolic interactionism fits with the conflict theory that there are tensions going on. Back to the structural functionists, if you want to look at a scholar, Parsons is one, and he says that families have functions, treat a child in a certain way, raise him up, and then they go to school, has functions and values and norms, and headmasters will give those to teachers who will give those, and we have a nice functioning society. However, Parsons pointed out that when you are at home in a family, you're treated as special and an individual, but when you go to school, everything has to be standardized. So at the beginning of first year of school, you might give a test, work out who the bright students are. You'll give them a lot more to do, work out who the less bright students are, you know where their job's going to be, so you give them whatever you feel suits. And is that right? And certainly they've done that. They had a whole streaming system in schools that would do that. And to some extent, we still do that. And at the end of year 11 or 12, you give a test and decide who goes on to uni and who doesn't. So this raises whole sorts of questions and social just questions and equal access questions. And sociology attempts to wrestle with those, and Christian sociologists attempt to wrestle with those. So a Christian religious paradigm is going to seek to adjust these norms and values and have a more Christian approach to all of these approaches. So apologies for those who've just come in. We've had some delays. So we began today by discussing the assignments, which we'll come back to. And now we're looking at the complexity of society and how the first theory of functionalism and structuralism says if you apply it to a classroom, having strict functions and structures, things will go well. Whereas conflict theory says there's something more competing under the surface. Some people are treated not so well as others. And so you could read about that. Paul Willis, in his study Learning Labour, says that different students are giving opportunity to learn different job labour opportunities. And so if your parents tell you you're going to be a lawyer or a doctor, and if you're going to a private school that's encouraging that, then you're going to learn in a certain way. But if you're told that this is not the way it's going to unfold, then can you see that your attitude could be quite different? And so Paul Willis said that once you start giving students lower than the norm in a class, they'll realize they're not going to be the successful ones in the class. So how are they going to get attention? The only way is to disrupt the lesson, become the class clown, play pranks on everyone, harass the conforming students who are trying to do well. And so there could be reasons for poor behavior, says Paul Willis. And so that's worth studying, I think. Willis also found that this is self-defeating, and also that's going to be a problem. And so can I get you to take a couple of minutes then to write down what do you think of these three theories and these extra insights? What are your thoughts on this? So can I get everyone to write down their thoughts? Chris, what are your thoughts, and then Nicole, on these theories? And then I guess we're going to write about them in an assignment, one of these, and then we're going to check, and it could be one of these major theorists, or you could choose any theorist who writes about these different insights. We've still got a week or so to get into these ideas a bit more, but Chris and then Nicole.
Yeah, I think functionalism gives a good framework of making clear and looking at the purpose of the school, rather than uh, probably often we can like get too far into the details of what are we teaching and how are we teaching, but it makes it look, we can look from the outside and say, what is the ultimate purpose of education? And that's going to look different, obviously, depending what worldview the person is looking through this paradigm or theory. So a secular school would have a very different function or purpose to education rather than the Christian. And so it's interesting, different worldviews adopting these paradigms seems to be interesting.
And so well said, Chris. And so in your assignment, you could have a third of your assignment, 2/3 of your assignment on these sorts of things, the function, why it's important to get ready for jobs, for healthy living, full functioning in society, knowing economics, knowing whatever those things are that you see as important. And then you've got a secular left wing, which would say we need to be sort of caring with one another, sharing with one another. And then the right wing is more about capitalistic, individualistic, focused on the individual can accomplish what they want, as opposed to the left wing, which is more socialistic. And interestingly, Christian views can be both left wing and right wing. And I think evangelicalism has moved towards the right. And so certainly over the last 30 years, evangelical Christians have said individuals can accomplish a great deal, and Martin Luther back in 1500 would have said individuals can accomplish a great deal. Catholics, however, who sort of come out of Spain and France, where they were a bit oppressed by kings and that, tend to have a bit more of a left-wing socialist worldview. So if you go onto Catholic websites and education, you'll actually see more social concern. So which worldview we live in? There's secularist left and right, there's Christian left and right, and then there is which world do you live in? And I've just recently visited schools and churches in country New South Wales, and out there you'd be educated in how to look after sheep and cows, and you'd be educated in a lot of areas. And so there's quite different expectations in different parts of the nation. If you're in one suburb of Sydney, you may have a different emphasis from another suburb of Sydney. And so there's all sorts of dynamics taking place. And the question is, as a teacher with 25 or 30 children coming from different backgrounds, you try and meet everyone's need, but some parents have got different goals to you. Some want them just to go out and get a working class job at $40 an hour. And others want them to go on and become doctors and lawyers. So there's different parent expectations. There's different social expectations. The children themselves may not want neither of those things. They might want to be actors, actresses, and musicians. And so you've got all of these dynamics. I find it valuable to go around the classroom and listen to all the students and try and find out where's your interest, where's your parents' interest, where's the cultural interest. Try and identify where they are. And then I think through how can we maximize the opportunities and possibilities for you as well. Nicole, your thoughts on how we address these challenges, and then David Southwood.
I'm not sure, is my speaker working now?
It is, it's going well.
Okay, good. I was actually thinking of functionalism as well, more in the context of students having the ability to break free from the function that's been set for them. Yeah, I was just thinking how sometimes the students themselves have a different idea of what they want to achieve than what their parents want them to, and the conflict that actually brings between the parents and the students, and how the teacher needs to be an intermediary in that.
Yeah, and so you've got some may only see people in plumbing or service industry or so, and they may think that's the option. My dad was a plumber, my uncle was a plumber, someone had a service industry in a bakery or something like that. Whereas they may dream of other things like being an actor or a musician. And so you've got those sorts of options. I think increased options is an important one, of which the widest option is these days they say university is going to give you the widest option, and you usually have two pathways. One is the general arts degree, which they some would say that the general arts degree is going to be the one that'll give you the most options. Others would say a specialized degree like accounting or something like that would give you the most options. So you got these challenges all the way along. But I know when I graduated from high school, they said to all of us, our area of the town needs more electricians, carpenters and plumbers, and that's where we encourage you to go get your apprenticeships. But whereas many people want to go on and become doctors and lawyers. And so what are your thoughts on that, Nicole?
Yeah, I was wondering about how that equates with the conflict theory, whether that kind of it morphs into the conflict theory a little bit, because yeah, I'm still getting my head around the two theories, but I see that in there is the conflict. I'm not quite sure how to put it across, but there becomes a conflict within the students' minds, and of course they raise up against their parents. Does that fit in the conflict theory?
Oh, absolutely. I think the interests there can be quite different to the students and the parents. And so, Gough Whitlam was quite remarkable when he said that there should be equal opportunity for everyone. He made university free for everyone. And so and then he tried to encourage, if anyone wanted to study to become a doctor, then you could always study. I think there was a rule that if you studied a subject and failed it twice, you then had to pay for it the third time. But the thought there was that everyone should have equal opportunity. In Germany, I think at the moment, every student can go to university at no cost. So there are countries around the world that try and give equal opportunity for everyone in society. Whereas Australia's followed an American model where you have to get a loan scheme. And the thought there is that you eventually pay back your loan, but there are some hidden problems with the loan scheme as well. Not only is the student in debt, the actual government is in debt because it's paid for your education, but it hasn't got the money yet. And so it tries to make that up. And so there's a problem for the students and a problem for the governments. And so that's another attempt to make things work. And at the moment, they're looking at making all the childcare and kindergartens free. And then more women will go to work. And if we get another 500,000 women working, the government, the country's better off. There's more income, they pay more taxes, etc. So there's a lot of flow-on effects. There's conflicting interests going on here, isn't there? And conflicting opportunities. And so conflict theory would say that it's important to listen to all the voices and give all the voices opportunity to be heard. And so conflict theory tries to come up with solutions as well. And so that's quite important. And then the symbolic interactionism says go further than looking at functions and conflicts, look at some of the other dynamics as to the complexity of language, the complexity of worldview there. And I think Christian perspectives are linked in with all of these in some ways. And I think Christianity brings a more loving, caring approach to these rather than some narrow secular approaches. David, what are your thoughts? And then Catherine after that.
I was just thinking about with conflict theory as well. Even though it addresses like the more common themes of like differences in class and social position, perhaps, but also what about self-imposed identities? Because students will always look to seek an identity or identify themselves with a group. So I just was thinking about how that might play into conflict theory and how teachers might be able to use that just to better understand their students.
Yes. And I think Christianity is very helpful there in that Christians can empower students to step out of where they're at. Jesus steps out of the Hebrew narrow confines of Pharisees and Sadducees and says, the Spirit of God empowers you for more. And so there is a Christian tradition of empowering for more. I think Martin Luther and John Calvin introduced this idea of empowerment for more. And all the way through history over the last 500,000, 2,000 years, there's been a Christian guideline for empowerment for more. And alongside that, you would have a secular guideline for empowerment for more as well, which would say, everyone has opportunity. So it's not just the Christians who are talking about self-identity. And next week, we want to talk a bit more about what this means, this self-identity. Catherine, your thoughts?
Yeah, just kind of the way that functionalism, only suits people like a certain type of person, or if it happens to be that the jobs they need is something you're interested in. Whereas, conflict theory addresses and helps understand anyone who's left out of that, or who don't necessarily want to fit into that society.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is that the functionalist system really does fit with that whole idea that if you fit in and do well, and if you're top of the pack, you'll do well. The functionalist system doesn't fit with the battlers so much, does it? It really is a real challenge there. Did anyone watch the ABC TV show which has the lady who's on Netflix, and she's an actor and she has disability at all? And Chloe Hayden. Does anyone come across the Chloe Hayden story? So Chloe Hayden had a dreadful experience at school in that things didn't go well for her, and because she has a huge disability, and she's got autism. And so all through school, she was bullied and picked on, and eventually she was going to fall apart. And they eventually withdrew her from school for a few years because school was going to be the worst thing for her. And everyone had worked out she was a female, she had autism, and she just wasn't going to go anywhere in life. She continually gets sensory overload. She has trouble with facial recognition. And when she was 13, she was diagnosed with autism, and so there was not much future for her in life, and they suggested she wouldn't get much of her job. She's now 26, and she's just got a logie for an actress, doing well. She's an author and has written, and so it really just shows she didn't fit in with the norms that society had given her, that she was not meant to succeed, because children with autism don't succeed, and schools don't give them anything that they need. So I thought that fits with what you're saying there, is that schooling, when it's set up to just meet the functions of society, sometimes doesn't meet the need of every student in your class. And it didn't meet her needs. And yet when people came up with the sort of support for her that she felt was needed, then she was able to go on and be very successful. So then those insights there are important. Is there anyone else wants to quickly speak up and give their view? So
I was just having a look at the
Isaac.
just having to think about the symbolic interactionism.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the fact that like changing the way we think. Spanish, I'm learning a little bit of it at the moment, and I've learned how it's a gendered language, and how everything you say is based upon it can mean different things for different people based upon which gender you use, either male version or female version. And I guess for comparing to English, an ungendered language, you kind of just wonder if people who speak gendered languages have a deeper understanding of the importance of gender, just as is in the like stability of society. Whereas for us, like gender, even within the way we speak, it's not really applicable. Like those two things aren't intertwined. It's not, I don't know if people would think that would change the way they think about all the gender issues we have now. But it was just a thought I had.
Yeah, certainly different Indigenous groups also see the world differently.
Yeah.
North American Indigenous groups see it differently. Asian cultures tend to be a group culture. That is, your family says things, you fit in with that. Whereas the European cultures and North American USA culture has gone towards a more individualistic approach to culture, and that may date back to Martin Luther. It may date back to certain Protestant Christian influences rather than Catholic, that have an emphasis on individualism. So certainly culture and society are quite complex. And as you say, gendered language is part of that complexity, and students coming from a different culture are going to have different perspectives and see different things in different ways. So they're great insights, Isaac, and you could even write a little bit on that, explore it a little bit. Someone else who might have a thought or a comment on these different approaches? Now, let me just go on to say there's plenty of material we could look at with George Herbert Mead, Vygotsky, Brunner, which talk about the way language, social interactions differ from one group to another. And that could be well explored quite a bit as well. Certainly, George Herbert Mead says that as children grow from early childhood, society's interacting with them in different ways. Then they go on to prep. They go through the play stage, the game stage. Social interactions are getting more complex, and the expectations that they give are more complex. Mead argues that active learning, where the children and students are involved, is going to lead to better outcomes, where it's passive learning, where we pour ideas in. Irving Goffman's interesting in that Goffman says that because we are looking to others to guide us as to our sense of identity, then we will perform to the expectation of the others who are looking to us. And so Goffman writes quite a lot about this idea of performance, but this is not, if that's okay, then we all perform, and so that would be useful. Shakespeare also made comments that way. Chris, do you have some thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on this idea? What are your thoughts on the idea of drama as a way of describing what happens, Chris?
I am not the drama teacher. I think it's interesting, entertaining, I suppose. I think
Yeah,
humans are drawn to entertainment and
yeah,
charisma in presentation. And there's studies that show it helps with memory if we can link like data to a specific environment or
yeah,
memory like that. So this is
yeah,
probably as far as I
yeah,
understand
I'm
it.
fully convinced. Yeah, Nicole, what are your thoughts on drama as a metaphor, as a way of understanding the way children perform to the teacher or perform to their peers? Either perform in a good way if they're in the top third of the class because they're getting reward, or perform in a bad way if they're not getting the reward and they perform to their lower achieving peers in order to feel good. What are your thoughts on the drama metaphor? And then if someone else want to make a comment after Nicole.
Was it Shakespeare that said life is a drama?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree that life in a classroom can be like a drama.
Yes.
With the different students expecting different things, and there's always something happening.
Yes.
And it's not always educational based, like my
Yes.
finger I saw a finger, and you look
Yes.
and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the finger. I mean, what
Yes.
do you say?
Yes. Wants a hug.
To
Wants
some
yes.
children, you know,
Yes.
the smallest thing, just
Yeah.
wants a band-aid, because a band-aid's a good
Yes.
thing to have.
Yes. Yes.
And as the children progress,
Yes.
the dramas still happen. They just become more
Yes.
mature dramas, like friendship dramas,
Yes.
relationship dramas, and so on. Yeah, I agree that life can be a drama.
Yes. And even as adults, we can play drama one to another. Oh, I feel so sad or hurt or whatever. When it's an act we put on, and we're probably wise not to do too much of that dramatic acting and be more honest and authentic, aren't we? Yeah. So very good. Someone else got a thought on this idea of drama. Helps us understand what the children are doing in the classroom, and therefore we can try to reward those in the lower third of the class in various ways that they're able to achieve. You find this in sport. You're teaching sport, and it's always easy for the top third who are wonderful at sport. But the real challenge is when you're teaching swimming or any of the sports to the bottom third, who are afraid of water, who struggle, and it's quite different. So anyone got any thoughts or comments?
When I studied drama in high school, we always talked about reacting to, like, when another person's saying their lines, like you've got to be reacting. And I often think of the way children behave as seeking a certain reaction, like when they're attention seeking because they're seeking connection and things like that. I think this is a good analogy for that, in that they're seeking a certain reaction from their peers or their teacher.
Yeah, that's great. That's such important and so valuable when teachers realise that's another way of looking what's going on. Something else we mentioned last week, and on one of the videos I prepared from last week, is the role of emotions. And so people aren't just thinking people, but they've got emotions that are happening. And it's important to make students aware that they are not their emotions, sad or angry. They are feeling. These are dials in their brain that are saying you could feel sad now, you could feel more happy now, and they can make choices as to how you feel. And it's not always easy to do at first, but it's possible to train children to think more happy. And it's important for us teachers to create happy environments rather than conflict environments. Social capital is also important, where people want to feel supported and have friendship around them. Robert Putnam has written on that. Social mobility says that students want to be able to grow. Feminist approaches are interesting in that the three waves of feminism, the first wave said women should be allowed to own land. Anyone agree with that there amongst us males? Women can own blocks of land and that sort of thing, houses. My mum struggled to own our house. My dad could own it in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, whereas women, banks weren't so convinced that they would have the money to pay for it. And then second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s went further and said women could have equal pay. And would society fall apart when that happened in the 60s and 70s? And then they could have financial independence, etc. And then we've now got third wave feminism that's seeking to go further as well. Now, this is a real challenge, because in a Christian school, if our schools are a bit right wing, then they may not want us to use the word feminism in our classes. So maybe it would be wise to use the word equality and certain Christian terms there. I just think it's interesting how we've got to be a bit cautious about, and particularly if you're in a country area where everyone in that country town was felt feminism was a whole lot of rubbish, say, then you'd have to be careful of the language you used as the school teacher in that country town, wouldn't you? So I think you've got to be wise in understanding these theories, but they certainly show that through history a lot's going on, and Christians have contributed through that history all the way through. So in the topics that we are looking at, we've sought to cover each of these different areas, and then we've also sought to apply this to the assignment that we are looking at. And then you'll see on the Moodle page, we mentioned that there were a number of resources that you could look at. So Parsons is the one who writes on structural functionism quite a lot. Conflict theory, I've suggested Cambridge Papers. Mead then writes on symbolic interactionism. Then you've got James Coleman says rational choice theory. That is, people will make the most rational choices. Now, the thing is, children don't have enough information to make rational choices, and even their parents often don't have enough information to make rational choices. And then we've got postmodern theory. Any questions, thoughts, Nicole?
Yeah. So is that a separate theory from the three that we've spoken about already?
Yeah, I think there would probably be dozens more theories that sociologists are seeking to explore to explain what's happening in society. And rational choice theory says that every one of us has a capacity to think and will make the most rational choices, whereas other people question that and say that there are other social pressures going on. Another one of those theories is the postmodern theories, and every one of those is totally different. So Foucault, Butler, Giddens, Castens, Bordeaux, Connell all probably have different postmodern theories. And so it's worth realizing that these are quite complex, and they critique modernity. They say that everyone doesn't have to work at a factory or be an accountant. People could actually go and be self-sufficient, or people could be artists, or there's lots more you could do with your life than fitting in with the functionalist modern industrial society, as what some of the postmodernists, they're talking about these complexities. And then we've got race theory and critical race theory. So race theory is sort of in the 1950s, Martin Luther King, and then critical race theory is going even further, and feminist and critical feminist theory there. So my encouragement, I was saying at the beginning of the lesson, is that you read at least one chapter of the textbook each week. That'll give you a feel for what sociology is seeking to do. It's quite a complex subject if you've not gone there. It's a new subject, like algebra in maths. If you've never been there, it comes across as quite a new foreign subject. We're probably a bit more familiar with psychology than sociology, or a bit more familiar with history than sociology. And so I encourage you, there's a lot of value in sociology. You may not get to look at it again, in that students don't get a chance to explore sociology very often, but there's lots of books on sociology out there, and we've got one that we'll look at, and I encourage you to read a chapter of that every week. And then I also encourage you to give maybe a third of your assignment to Christian perspectives. And so in Christian perspectives, we could think about God created the world very functionally. That is, it's a good world and you can fit in. And Moses seems to have quite a functionalist approach when he gives the 10 Commandments, and he builds a tabernacle, and then they build a temple under David and Solomon. And so this is quite functional. You come and you offer your sacrifices, you learn the laws, you fit in with the functions of what was originally an agricultural society with crops and animals, and then it moved to become a more urban society. And then at the time of Jesus, it's becoming quite urbanized under the Romans and the Greeks and others. And so there's a lot talking about functionalism, and to some extent Jesus talks about the wisdom of function, but to some extent Jesus fits with the conflict theory, in that he takes a stand against the Romans and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and says every individual is important. You don't have to fit in with the slave function and row a boat for the Romans or become a gladiator. God could have something for your life. You don't have to put out young babies to be sacrificed because we can't afford to look after too many babies like they practiced. Every individual is created by God. So Jesus was in some way standing up for the marginal. And so a Christian perspective could go there. And also Augustine and others talk about the complexity of language, which is the third theory as well. If we look at humanistic approaches to sociology, psychology, etc., they talk about the goodness of man. So they focus on the first part of the Christian perspective, which focuses on the goodness side of things. Some would argue that humanists don't consider sin and redemption enough, whereas the Christian perspective often includes both, but different groups focus on different aspects of that. So Glasser would be considered a humanist, and certainly education really values the insights that Glasser makes, where every member of the classroom is valuable. Christians would say this is because they're created in the image of God. They have value. Every member of the classroom has to take responsibility for their actions. Christians would say this relates to the fall and the need for redemption. Glasser would speak about transformation. Christians would speak about redemption and transformation. And Fennemer has written quite a nice article on this, and there's lots of others who emphasize the Christian perspective. We need to recognize that children, every age group now, highly specialized, we understand that every age, it's going to be totally different what happens in a classroom. So I think we almost specialise in understanding the children in every age of primary and secondary school. And then if you go on to adolescent development, it's been said that they become more cognitively able and they become cocky and they take risks more. A study of adolescence we could look at, that could be a whole week where we could study adolescence, or a whole week we could study childhood. Milbank and others have written about theology and social theory, saying that an understanding of theology of God and Jesus can help us understand what's going on. But I found that Cambridge papers were very useful in that Michael Schluter, who was an economist when he came back to Cambridge University after working with the World Bank, set up a Cambridge discussion group which talks about the major social issues. And he said it's not just the left that are correct when they emphasise justice, and it's not just the right who are correct when they emphasise effort or stewardship. Things are more complex than that, and our Christianity needs to be more complex than that. And so these insights from the Cambridge sociology discussion groups I find are incredibly valuable, and so you could have a look at these Cambridge sociology discussion groups, and you'd find a lot of value in those. And
I'm
then
sorry.
yeah,
It's me again.
yeah, good.
Can you just put that up again? Left was about justice, right was about right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I missed the last little bit.
yeah, I'll do that for sure.
Sorry, I just wasn't quick enough.
Yep. So we'll go back up. So Michael Schluter is the scholar who set up the Cambridge Papers writing group in Cambridge. And his argument is that the left, they stress justice. And so in Catholic countries where people are often downtrodden, in South America or parts of Spain, they often say the downtrodden need a greater sense of justice. And liberation theology comes out of those sort of countries. Whereas the right, where you've got a lot of resources and you've got Model T Ford and Henry Ford, and you can really thrive, then America, everyone can become an astronaut and president and flourish and thrive. When I talk to Americans, they do find that not everyone has that opportunity. And so they too can become a bit left-oriented. But the right-oriented says everyone can accomplish things. And so they need stewardship and effort and those things. And so the Cambridge Papers is a great resource. And you could go to the Cambridge Papers and you could look up some of these resources there. So the Jubilee Centre is the organisation, and the Cambridge Papers, just some samples that I could put up for you now include, say, the following. Let's take one. Let's put it up. This is one of the Cambridge Papers, and you can look at all of them in a second. This one's on gender. And so there's some great articles here. If you quote them in an assignment, you need to make sure that you can identify who the scholar is who writes the article. So this one's by Christopher Townsend on gender, and then it discusses the whole gender question. So that's quite good. And then if you want to view all of the Cambridge papers, it lists them here. And as you flick through, we've got one on race theory, so that's valuable. And then we've got another on other articles. But if we go to the race theory one, so if you chose race to look at, and we've said already that it'd probably be worth looking at one racial group, such as an Indigenous group, if you chose there, or gender, particularly female students, but male students can also look at gender. And so that can be important as well. Artificial intelligence, people write a lot on recently there. Values, I found, was an interesting one to look at. And then the media, another one on gender, that might be the one that we're looking at. Modern crisis of identity in the modern world. And then biodiversity and the natural world. Apartheid is another one that we've got there. So there's a lot of great articles, but the most valuable thing to go for is Google Scholar, and whichever topic that you have chosen, you could put education and sociology into Google Scholar, or you could choose what theme you're going to write your assignment on, and that would be very useful as well. So today we've tried to introduce these different theories, and we're going to look at them more next week. And also we've related this to your assignment. And then in the weeks to come, we'll go further and introduce gradually more theories, because there's so many of them. Next week, we want to focus on self-identity. We mentioned rational choice today. We mentioned emotion. We mentioned social capital. We mentioned feminism, and that can relate to gender. And then there's a whole discussion that's often on deviance. That is, why do some choose deviance and crime? Often it's because they can't succeed in a world that focuses on other areas. So it's an alternative sense of identity. And then we briefly introduced Christianity as a way of looking at the world and what's going on with a caring approach that combines functionalism, that is God-given functions in the natural world, with a recognition of the fallen nature and a tendency towards selfishness and deviance, and also recognizing that everyone has limited knowledge, limited understanding of everything. Only God knows all things. So students are going to make poor decisions at times, and it's important that we as teachers equip them to make the best decisions as we go through. And then going back to the assignment, we ask you to choose one theory, and it could be quite narrow. You could choose a part of feminism, or a part of functionalism, or a part of conflict theory. And you could have quite a third of that could include a Christian perspective on conflict theory. What does Jesus bring to the recognition of the downtrodden? You could look at a Christian perspective on marginalization, a Christian perspective, recognizing that your second assignment also has to choose one of these themes, gender, class, or one of those as well. So you could start thinking about your second assignment when you start thinking about this assignment. What questions do we have about the assignments and about these sociological topics that we're looking at each week? And just while you're thinking about that, we run the class from this time period. It looks like 5 o'clock till 6:30 works for most. And hands up those who got to go to another class at 6:30 in 5 minutes time or so. So it looks like many students do. So yeah, we need to be aware of that. And then I'll try and put a video up in the next couple of days, and that'll give you a chance to have a bit more material where I'll go through things again as well. But what questions have you got? And while you are thinking about the questions, I might get you to write down, what are the 3 or more things you got out of tonight's class in this hour and a half? So writing down, what are the 3 or so things you got out of tonight's class? And then also, do you have questions?
Yes, sir.
Chris?
Do you have to agree with the theory that you choose for task 1?
One of the best academic approaches is to present a balanced approach for 2/3 of your essay, where 50% of the time you say some people say one thing, some people say the other. The best assignments then draw a conclusion in the last third of the assignment. So I think it's best not to begin with your viewpoint. It's best to begin by saying, you are open to looking at the evidence, and then present, some people say one side of the argument, and some people say the other side of the argument, and then you should do some research over at least a few days or a week or so, gather some of both sides, then you should think about both sides, and then you may conclude, I haven't a clue, it still seems confusing, but you're probably still best to choose one side or the other, whichever you think might present the best argument, and run with that. That's the debating approach, isn't it? Yeah. Other questions?
Just in terms of the symbolic interactionism, it's
Yes.
talking about the language we use, and by symbols, does it mean the writing, like the written language?
Certainly writing seems to be the major language that we in the West and developed countries use. But if you were to go to India or parts of Asia or Fiji, it may be less than that, though most countries are seeking to emphasize written language. Up until 50 or 100 or 150 years ago, more than half the country weren't so focused on written language. Now, for various reasons, societies have tried to get written language down to a very small number who can't use the written language. And the two reasons are for jobs, because jobs mean everyone does well and there's less crime. And when everyone does well, they flourish. So there's a social concern as well. So written language is emphasized. Written language is always within bodily expressed. Written language always contains certain sociological paradigms, like if up until 30 years ago, we always said he said, meaning men and women, and now there's a move away from gendered language. And in America, they new international version of the Bible got rid of he for God, and then they tried to sell it to Americans, and Americans just wouldn't accept it. So then they got rid of all of those changes and went back to he for God, because that keeps Americans happy. And so there's commercial decisions, not just efforts for various social perspectives. Yeah.
And does the the symbols related to through symbolic interactionism, does that also extend to art or like physicality, or is it literally just written language?
Oh, it can, and it can be a dress code. And
okay.
Dress code can communicate. And so real estate agents always have to wear a tie and suit, and farmers have to dress differently. So dress code is a symbol, and your classroom will have symbols. And do the prep teachers dress differently to the primary teachers, dress differently to the accounting teachers, differently to the physical education teachers? I mean, there's symbolism happening all around us, and in politics, there's symbolism happening all the time. So the idea of symbolic interactionism says that the symbols are larger than the language we use, and there's such complexities in language and in art. And then a study of art. We went from before 1900, back in 1500, art tended to be religious. And then art in 1700 incorporated the landscape, so religion became a bit more, the landscape's beautiful. And then around about 1900, it went abstract, and then it went modernist. And so, art also reflects symbols, and architecture reflects symbols. So there's symbolism all around us. and our schools and classrooms and have more symbols going on than just language. But you want an inviting classroom culture and environment, don't you? And you want inviting language where everyone fits in and goes on. And I know in the upper primary, some teachers will still have early primary picture books because they want every student to feel included. And so I think inclusion is so important, isn't it? Yeah. Other questions? So if there's no more questions, I think we've fairly well covered these theories just as an intro. Again, we've not gone so deeply into them. That is, we have functions and structures in society. They're meant to be beneficial, but they can sometimes benefit less than everybody. And underneath the surface, there's conflicts going on. Some are in the working class, they're missing out. Some are in families and cultures missing out. Some are in genders missing out. And you get to explore that in your 2 assignments and even more in the second assignment. And then symbolic interactionism says there's complex symbols there as well. So can I pray for you as we conclude? If anyone wants to stay on and ask questions, feel free. And our Christian perspective says that there is structure and function in God's plan, but God also is aware of the way humans treat one another for not very good reasons. And there is redemption and transformation. And then there is an understanding of the complexities of language in theological and Christian approaches as well. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this opportunity to better understand the societies around us and better understand ourselves. Lord, we pray as we look at that first assignment where we reflect on our own experiences, Lord, you to help us to understand those not so very good times and those times that really motivated us, and help us to communicate that to help students well. We pray for our futures, that you guide us and help us in all our studies to prepare well for those. And we thank you that you're with us and with our students. Help us to communicate that sense of your presence and goodness and hope for all students in our teaching and our lives always. Amen. So if you have any more questions, happy to answer those. If you want to send me any answers, if you have any time preferences outside the time of 5 to 6:30, a half hour before or afterwards, always happy to catch up, discuss assignments. If you want to see any drafts, happy to look at those. If you want to send through just questions, ideas that you have, happy to do that. If you want to go on the voting and vote and say, I'd like more emphasis on Christian perspectives or on other perspectives, in the introductory 2 or 3 tiles, there's a voting section where you can say, I want more information on heavy sociological theory or other ideas. We can fit with that as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all the efforts you're making, the great work you're doing, and the great roles you'll be playing in teaching people going forward as well. It's a very exciting profession, but it's one that's important to be well prepared for, and to be well prepared for in terms of self-care. That is, realise there will be challenges out there. There's conflicting notions. Parents have got different viewpoints. Not every student wants to succeed. If we can understand what's going on and the social pressures on that, then we can be more caring and care for ourselves as well on the way through. Have buddies around you, understand yourself and your emotions and your life journey as well, because that's important. You got to last in the battle that's out there. Yeah, it's although I was talking to a year 2 student teacher, and he said he doesn't have any of those problems. He sets the clear guidelines and the students follow it, and he's very happy. So it's not always so difficult, but be prepared if it is. Thank you. I'll see you next Monday, same time, and we'll look at identity further next Monday and your identity as the teacher and of the student. Catch you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.